Hello class. This week we're going to be talking about Chapter 10, which covers inequality on a global scale or international social stratification. So last week we looked at stratification in the United States in particular. So this week we're going to take a little bit of a broader view of stratification across the world. On this first slide, I have an introductory video for you. It's about 9 minutes long, and it'll just give a little bit of an overview of what we'll be talking about today. It introduces you to some of the factors that drive global inequality and covers geographic, institutional, and cultural factors. So again, as with all of the videos posted on my PowerPoints, you can access these on Blackboard, either by way of the PowerPoint itself or the file folder on Blackboard that contains all the videos for Chapter 10 in this case. Now on this slide, I have embedded a link to a documentary from documentarian John Pilger, and it's called The New Rulers of the World. Again, you can find this on Blackboard. It's about an hour-long documentary, but I just ask that you watch the first 15 minutes of it. But in this documentary, John Pilger asks the question in the beginning, is this the global village we are told is our future, or is it merely an old project that used to be run by the divine right of kings and is now run by the divine right of multinational corporations and by the financial institutions and governments that back them? So in this documentary, John Pilger looks at large multinational supply chains and the low-pay labor forces in poor countries who produce many of the products we buy in our country and in richer countries around the world. John Pilger, he questions whether globalization is actually benefiting all countries. And his focus in this documentary is particularly on Indonesia, which was first colonized by the Dutch in the 16th century. So he makes some connections in this documentary, kind of asking how different kind of that 16th, 17th century colonialism is from today's kind of more what he would call like a corporate colonialism. So instead of having kings that were controlling colonies, now there's multinational corporations and financial institutions that in very similar ways also control, to an extent, the lives, especially of people in less advantaged countries. So again, he's looking at Indonesia, and he spends a lot of time talking to factory workers, seeing kind of what their day-to-day lives are. And he finds that most of the factory workers in Indonesia make about $1 a day. They live in labor camps. He says there's no running water, there's open sewage. He even says that while he was there studying them and talking with them, he caught dengue fever while he was actually filming this documentary. So Indonesia has areas that are called economic processing zones, which are basically small cities full of sweatshops that make products for Nike and Gap. And the people that work there also generally live there in kind of dilapidated, overcrowded housing. And how John Pilger gets into the factories, he pretends to be a fashion buyer. and gets access inside the sweatshops by doing that. And he sees thousands of women on the floor of the factory. There's no air conditioning. He talks to the employees, and they say they work 24-hour shifts, standing up with very few breaks. No employee rights, and they're mandated to produce 3,000 pieces of clothing per shift. So this was produced back in the 90s, but unfortunately, these practices definitely are still going on around the world. So just go ahead, watch the first 15 minutes. It'll give you a pretty good overview of the documentary. Of course, if you want to watch the whole thing, I definitely would love for you to do that as well. And this documentary will also kind of serve as an introduction, get us ready to start thinking about global inequality for the remainder of this lecture. And one more introductory video for you. This one's pretty short, and it's a recap of the OXFAM World Inequality Report from 2020. I'll just highlight kind of the main points that are made in this video. This OXFAM World Inequality Report for 2020 found that 2,153 people controlled more money than the poorest 4.6 billion people combined. And that's global, on a global scale. Furthermore, those 2,153 people that control all that money are all men. So there's no women in that top tier of global society, the global elite, if you will. And this interview also, of course, kind of piggybacking on that fact that they're all men, it highlights the current state of the feminization of poverty, and especially in light of all these state budget cuts to public expenditures and public spending across the globe. Global inequality, or global stratification, is the study of the concentration of certain resources, both monetary and environmental, in certain nations. The amount of resources a country has at its disposal greatly affects the amount of power the country can wield internationally. Because, for instance, if you have control of most of the world's money, you have control over the oil pipelines, you have control over certain mines for precious metals that are non-renewable. These are all things that are very valuable for the global economy. So whoever controls all these things kind of puts other nations at a disadvantage. So on this slide, we are going to look at the Gini coefficient, which is an economic measurement renowned for determining income inequality between countries. So the Gini coefficient is based on a scale between 0 and 1. So 0 represents complete equality in the society, and a score of 1 represents complete inequality. Globally, inequality between countries has been growing at a steady pace since 1820, so really since the Industrial Revolution. And you can see a depiction of that growth on that graphic on this slide here. So in other words, if a country has a score of 0, that means that everyone in the country receives the same exact income, and there's complete equality between all the citizens. If a country has a score on the Gini coefficient of 1, which is complete inequality, that would mean that all of the money in that country is going to one person and everyone else is getting absolutely nothing. So the United States most recent Gini coefficient for 2019 was a 0.49. So kind of right in the middle of the scale between 0 and 1. And if you want to learn a little bit more about the Gini index, you can follow this link here on the bottom of the slide. So what is global stratification? Global stratification is defined as the unequal distribution of wealth among nations. When we study stratification, we look at wealth gaps between different nations, but also those within nations. So again, last week we looked at stratification within the US, and this week we're going to look a bit more at the wealth gaps between different countries around the world. So the global map on this slide here illustrates the regional differences in national wealth across the globe. So the countries that are shaded in blue represent the highest income nations. The purple represent higher middle class nations. And the red shaded countries represent lower middle wealth nations. And then the yellow represents the poorest nations around the world. So depending on which country you are born into, you can see that there would be a lot of ramifications depending on whether you're born in a low-income country, a lower middle-income country, an upper middle-income country, or a high-income and wealth country. And just those economic differences can affect the so many aspects of the people's lives who live in those countries. So on these next 3 slides, I have a few graphic depictions of the many social and health factors that global inequality can have an effect on. So here on slide 7 covers population. So you can see most of the global population lives in low or lower middle wealth nations. Then we have life expectancy. You can see life expectancy is 19 years less in poor countries than in rich countries. Then deaths under age 5, so children or infants passing away. And it says 120 out of 1,000 children will die by age 5 in poor countries, whereas that number is only 7 out of 1,000 in rich countries. Then we have access to improved sanitation, where only 35% of people have access to toilets and plumbing in poor nations, whereas 99% of rich citizens have access to toilets and plumbing. Then we have deaths caused by infectious disease, and it says 36% of people in poor countries die of infectious disease, whereas that number is 7% in richer countries. And then years of education. The average person in a poor country attends school for just under 8 years, 7.9 years, but a person living in a rich country will attend school for 13 to 14 years. So here on slide 8, we have a few more examples. So slide 8 covers the literacy rate and says that 66% of citizens in poor countries can read and write, but that number is 98% of people in rich nations can read and write. Then we have the fertility rate. In the poorest countries, parents have 4 children on average, but in richer countries, they only have 2 children per family. So smaller nuclear families in richer countries. Then we have population growth here. So the poor nations are growing by 2.27% each year, whereas the richest nations are only growing at a rate of 0.39. Then we have migration rates. Many more people are migrating to rich countries where there are negative migration rates in the poorer countries and even in the upper middle class countries. So all of your migration is heading into the high income countries. And let's see, then we have urban population. So in poorer countries, 27% of the population lives in cities. So most of their populations are more rural. But in rich countries, 78% of the population lives in and around a major metropolitan area or a city. Then here, slide 9, have a few more examples. We have access to the telephone. So 22% of the populations in poor nations have access to phone communication, whereas it says 106%. So pretty much the entire populations in high income and wealth countries have access to a telephone or own a cell phone. But again, that number is only 22 in the low income and 47% of the population in the lower middle income. Then we have internet access. So internet access, 2.3% of people in low income countries have access to the internet, whereas that number is 68.3% in high income countries. Then we have personal computers. 1.2% of people in the lower income countries have access to a computer, whereas 60.4% of people in the richest countries have access to or own a personal computer. Then vehicles or cars. In your poorest countries, about 6 out of every 1,000 people have access to a car or own a car, where that number is 435 out of every 1,000 people owns a car in the richest nations. And then move to kind of a more environmental aspect. Carbon dioxide emissions. So that means the higher the number here, the more pollution your country is creating. So you can see pollution is primarily being emitted by the higher income countries, and the lower income countries are not really polluting the environment very much. So there's a lot of different ways to describe categories of global inequality, but some ways that we are used to talking about global inequality, they kind of carry a Eurocentric or ethnocentric bias. So for example, some terms that we are used to, like undeveloped, developing, or developed nations, or third world, second world, and first world countries. I'm sure you've heard this kind of terminology before, but if you kind of really think about the implications of the language that we use, to describe these kinds of differences, they carry implications that countries that are not technological or industrialized are maybe quote-unquote third rate or last place or not achieving their full potential, but that potential is being defined by the rich countries. So that's why sociologists sometimes criticize these kinds of terms of classification, because that, again, that full potential is based on a comparison of the highest income countries that are in a way kind of looking down upon countries that don't reflect their own industriousness or beliefs about productivity. So on these next few slides, we're going to look at some different ways that sociologists and researchers of global inequality have come up with thinking about global inequality and what drives global inequality, and how to address it, and how to kind of conceptualize it as well, so how we talk about it. So this video on slide 11, it's 14 minutes, and it's just an introductory video before we kind of delve into these different theoretical perspectives on the next few slides. So this video will just give you a little snapshot, introductory look at the different theoretical perspectives that sociologists take on when examining global stratification. So you can go watch this on Blackboard, linked to on Blackboard, and then on the next few slides we will delve into these theoretical perspectives in a bit more detail. Scholars view global inequality from pretty different perspectives. So the next few slides will cover the basics for each of these perspectives. And on this slide, we're going to start with probably the one that's most prominent, especially in kind of our textbooks in Western or richer nations, which is modernization theory. So this one should sound pretty familiar to you. So modernization theorists would most likely use a categorization of undeveloped, developing, and developed nations. They view lower income countries as kind of falling short when it comes to industrialization and kind of growing their economies. So as a solution, modernization theorists would claim that poor countries need to change their cultural values and move toward industrialization and strategies for economic growth so that they can become more rich and more powerful. So the idea here is that every country could become a rich country if they just invested in the right industries, and implemented certain economic policies. And modernization theorists would say that every country, if they industrialize, we could all be equally rich across the globe. So the most common critique of this modernization theory is that it can be a bit ethnocentric, assuming that all people around the world should be concerned with industrialization and technology or profit and power, because there's a lot of different ways of thinking about our resources and what drives our lives, what is the meaning of life, and different societies, especially based on their religious beliefs, might have, or more communitarian ethos. They might have a different perspective when it comes to, say, maybe installing a pipeline that might pollute some water. Like more rich industrialized countries might sometimes go ahead with a project like that in order to be profitable and maintain their power in the global economy. But there's other ways of thinking in all societies that would not see that sacrifice as useful for their society. So they would rather keep their clean river than, say, install an oil pipeline. So this is why it can be kind of criticized as being, a bit ethnocentric, because their richer countries are in a way kind of applying their own ways of living and thinking and believing onto other countries and calling them undeveloped or underdeveloped. So at the same time, and as we'll see on the next few slides, there are other critics who claim that rich countries actually depend on some countries being poor so that they can have easy access to cheap labor and cheap resources in order to maintain kind of their place in the global hierarchy. So we will look a bit more into some different theories that sociologists have introduced kind of to counter modernization theory. So one of the theories that sociologists have come up with, and a different perspective on global stratification, is dependency theory. So you can see the graphic here where high-income countries are sending money to low-income countries, and then low-income countries are sending cheap labor and cheap natural resources to high-income countries. So it's this kind of cycle of dependence, the way that they are seeing global stratification. So you can see high-income countries, the graph says they exploit lower income countries, they use the labor and resources of low-income countries, and they create and encourage dependence of low-income countries on high-income countries. And then the low-income countries over here on the right, they don't really have a lot of infrastructure, they rely on high-income countries, they sell cheap labor and natural resources, and they receive loans and become indebted to high-income countries, which is called a structural adjustment program, and we will talk about that a bit more very shortly. So dependency theory claims that global inequality is primarily caused by industrial and post-industrial nations exploiting the cheap labor and natural resources of other nations, thus creating this cycle of dependence that is kind of virtually inescapable. So they claim that the global organization of wealthy countries, like in the OECD or the World Bank, they make loans to poorer countries with a promise to bring them up in the global hierarchy. But those loans and offers of assistance usually end up solidifying the rich countries' dominance over the poorer ones, usually because those loans come with interest rates that are excessively high, and the poor countries just cannot possibly repay them. And so they become even explicitly kind of indebted to rich countries. So dependency theorists claim that rich countries only want poor countries to industrialize to the extent that they will be able to exploit their cheap labor and natural resources, but not enough so that they actually become a threat to their kind of economic power. So the dominant language used to describe global stratification during the Cold War between 1945 and 1980 was First World, Second World, and Third World. So First World referred to capitalist countries. Second World referred to countries that were kind of staying neutral or slightly leaning toward capitalism or communism. And then Third World countries referred to communist countries. So there's an additional category of Fourth World to describe people who don't align with a specific nation, such as indigenous minority groups, prisoners, or homeless populations. And this is referred to as the era of, quote, noblesse oblige, which also means first world responsibility. And this kind of first world responsibility took root, and that meant that during this era there was kind of this feeling that first world countries, the capitalist countries, had a duty to help second and third world countries grow and develop and kind of turn their back on the USSR and kind of the communist movement that they were trying to establish across the globe. Now, another way to think about and talk about global classification and global inequality is going to come from a pretty renowned sociologist named Immanuel Wallerstein, and he came up with this entirely new theory called the world systems approach. And you would say he's kind of a dependency theorist, but he kind of took dependency theory to a new level. So Wallerstein was a Marxist theorist and sociologist who came up with this completely new terminology when it comes to categorizing nations in terms of global inequality. Similar to dependency theory, Wallerstein thought of the global economy as this complex and interconnected system that supports an economic hierarchy that places some nations in positions of power with numerous resources, while other nations remain in this kind of subordinate position. So in other words, the wealth and progress of the wealthy nations is, quote unquote, like born on the backs of the poor nations. And Wallerstein believed that there actually needs to be some nations that are disadvantaged in order for the rich nations to remain rich. So Wallerstein is definitely a conflict theory kind of perspective on global inequality. And as you can see, we're going to go a bit more into his categories on the net and classification on the next slide. But his three categories he came up with, if you see on this picture of the globe up top on this slide, you'll see these categories and the key here of the core, semi-periphery, and periphery. So we'll break those down on the next slide here. But you can see that the core is represented by like Canada, the United States, the UK, and Australia, Japan. And then you see the semi-periphery in yellow, a big chunk of South America, Mexico, semi-peripheral, Russia, China, India, South Africa. And then we have his third category of the periphery. So the large majority of Africa, some East Asian countries, the Philippines, much of Saudi Arabia here in East Asia. So on the next slide, let's delve a little bit more into kind of what these categories meant for Wallerstein. So again, Wallerstein's world systems categories are core, semi-periphery, and periphery. So the core nations are the dominant capitalist countries that are highly industrialized, technological, and primarily urbanized. So most people live in the cities or around a city. So the U.S. is an economic powerhouse that can support or deny support to important economic legislation that has far-reaching implications. So other than the U.S., some other core nations would be the United Kingdom, Spain, France, Sweden, Germany, and Japan. Then we have the peripheral nations, which are the poorest nations. They have no or very little industrialization. They're usually focused more on rural, agricultural production. Peripheral nations often purchase and utilize outdated cast-offs. So, for instance, a lot of factories during like the 70s and 60s in the US put off a lot of environmental damage, a lot of pollution. So during that time, a lot of our kind of factories and the machinery that was part of them, because so many environmental laws were being passed in rich countries, a lot of those kind of pollutant aspects of the factories were just sold to poorer countries, and they're being used there now. So that's what that means when they kind of purchase the cast-offs of the core nations. So they usually have, again, a lot of corruption and instability in their governments. There's inadequate social programs, not great education systems or health care, and they are heavily dependent on the core nations for jobs and aid. So some examples of the periphery are Vietnam, Bangladesh, Ghana, most of African nations, the Philippines, and Honduras. And then he has kind of this middle category of the semi-peripheral nations. And these are kind of your in-between nations. They're not able to really dictate policy, but they also act as a major resource for raw material, oil, gold, materials for creating computers and cell phones. And the semi-periphery represents kind of this emerging middle-class marketplace for core nations. So some examples of the semi-periphery would be Mexico, China, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and South Africa. And then on this slide, we kind of have the standard economic classification of global inequality. So this is what you would see come out from like the World Bank, which is kind of strictly just looking at economic differences. So they would classify countries as high income, low income, or middle income. So high income nations, according to the World Bank, means that most citizens make at least $12,747 a year, with the average high income citizen making about $44,000 a year. These countries are overwhelmingly urban, again, live a lot toward and in the cities, and they make up the Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development, the OECD, which is a global organization of the 34 most wealthy countries across the globe. And you can see in the bottom right picture here, kind of a depiction of what countries make up the OECD. So Canada, the United States, Iceland, Sweden, Finland, Norway, Australia, and Turkey, Greece, Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, Austria, Germany, Poland, Czech Republic, the Netherlands, the UK, Ireland, and New Zealand, and Japan. So those are your OECD countries, and they are also your high-income nations. So the high-income nations, they are privileged, but there are kind of two common issues that high-income nations confront. The first of which being capital flight, and that's when industries move to poorer countries in search of cheaper labor and production and less strict laws concerning labor and pollution. So we've all heard of, especially since the 1980s, 70s, and 80s in the US, we've become less and less of a kind of factory-based society, and that was mostly due to the fact that a lot of factories between 1975 and now have relocated their factories to Mexico or China or the Philippines or Indonesia in search of kind of more profitable places to make their goods for the global marketplace. But of course, when industries leave a country like that, especially a rich country, that kind of changes the entire economic kind of landscape for the country. There's a lot less jobs, a lot more insecurity. So that's capital flight. And then we also have the second issue that richer countries face, which is deindustrialization, which again is that outcome of capital flight. When there's no more jobs, maybe entire cities start to shut down because the factory leaves and there's no jobs there and no one can live there anymore. So the economy generally within deindustrialization shifts to a more service-oriented economy rather than production. So the US is definitely a service economy at this point. The majority of the jobs in the United States are service jobs. So like customer service or working in retail, doing other service-oriented jobs, being a bank teller, a cashier at a grocery store, etc., etc. So most of our jobs are service-oriented. And the kind of drawback of that for high-income nations is that when you shift to a service economy, companies will generally pay lower wages for this kind of work, and there's less job security because in a service economy, many of the jobs are not very highly skilled, which means each employee is very easily replaceable, easy to replace, easy to hire someone else and train someone else. Whereas if you worked in a factory and you had a very specific skill and you were amazing at it, you would have a lot more job security because you would know, well, not everyone can, not just anyone can do my job. The second tier of global stratification and classification from the World Bank is middle-income nations. So middle-income nations means that most citizens make between $1,000 and $12,746 a year. So it's a pretty broad brush there. Of course, your life will be pretty different if you're making $1,000 a year versus just under $13,000. But the average citizen in a middle-income country makes about $7,500 a year. These countries are more urban than rural, but there are still significant populations living in rural settings. So some examples are China, Namibia, and Thailand. Now, one major issue that faces middle-income nations are what I referred to a couple slides ago, these structural adjustment programs. So on the next slide, we're going to look a little bit more into what structural adjustment programs, or SAPs, are, and the resultant debt accumulation that they cause for middle-income and low-income countries. The richest international organizations and global banks like the IMF, International Monetary Fund, or the World Bank will offer middle-income countries loans in order to fund their expansion and growth goals. Middle-income countries must agree, in exchange for the loan, to change their labor laws, remove restrictions on environmental regulations, and privatize, in other words, allow multinational corporations to access and deplete their most precious natural resources in exchange for the loan. Usually, middle-income countries are unable to pay back the loans due to the interest rates on them, and also because of kind of corruption within the middle-income countries, where maybe a small, powerful elite within the country will take most of the money from the loan, and the actual people of the nation never really see a benefit from it. But at the same time, the countries can't really repay the loans, and so all of the people kind of pay the burden for the loan that kind of corrupt politicians and businessmen have made happen. And this leads to even greater insecurity in the global hierarchy, because at that point the middle-income nations are literally in debt to the high-income nations and have to pretty much do what they say. So this documentary on this slide goes quite into depth on structural adjustment programs. This is another documentary by John Pilger, and this one is called War by Other Means. And it looks at kind of an in-depth at the practice of offering structural adjustment programs to middle-income or semi-peripheral countries, and the many unintended side effects on the people living in those countries once those plans go into effect. Pilger refers to the principal weapon of today's war on poorer countries as debt. So he says today there's a debt war going on. The documentary looks at the history of the creation of the World Bank, which funds most of these structural adjustment programs, and Pilger points out that the Philippines pays 44% of its national budget every year just to interest payments from foreign banks. So almost half of the Philippines' national budget every year is just paying back their loans to foreign banks. And he compares that with only 3% of the Philippines' national budget going toward public health funding. So he looks a bit in depth at, in particular, the Philippines case in this documentary. And since that structural adjustment program was put in place in the Philippines, the percentage of people living in poverty in the country has actually risen by 25%. So that kind of fact kind of throws a wrench in kind of the modernization theory perspective of inequality, that if a country just makes the right investments and opens up their economy, that they will become a richer country. In contrast, here we can see that actually, especially in the case of the Philippines, which kind of took these loans from the World Bank in hopes of kind of industrializing. It's actually been quite detrimental to the Filipino people. So the World Bank and other international banks, like the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, would offer loans to poorer countries. But the people of the countries never really had a say in the loans, only the elite political leaders in the country. In exchange, the countries would have to open up their countries to international industries, privatize their public resources. So for instance, if there was let's say there's a lake and that's where a lot of people were retrieving their water from to bathe for, or to drink, or to cook with. And then as a result of a structural adjustment program, they privatize that lake. That means that the people who have been using it can no longer use it. So privatization of public resources, there's cuts to public funding for health, clean water, and education. There's drives to break unions and reduce wages, and employee rights get cut back, or then you have the kind of dismantling of environmental regulations, and the need to open up access for deforestation and pollution, and converting public agricultural land that people use to produce their own food into privatized, quote, economic zones. So this documentary, it's a pretty great overview of kind of these middle income countries and this cycle of debt that they have really been pulled into, especially since the 1970s. So I hope y'all will watch most of this one, but particularly watch the beginning to about minute 17, and then watch the last 20 minutes or so of it, and you'll get a pretty good idea of what John Pilger is trying to communicate with this documentary. And here we'll look at the third classification under the World Bank, classification by income, which is the low-income countries. So low-income countries are made up of people who make less than $1,000 a year, with the average person in these countries making about $528 a year. So these countries are primarily rural, so they produce a lot of their own food and farm it, and they contain the vast majority of the global population. Some examples are Myanmar, Ethiopia, and Bangladesh. And of course, the issues that often confront people in these low-income countries are poverty and the feminization of poverty, which is defined as when women disproportionately are affected by global poverty. And we can look at the graphics on this slide. You can see on this one on the left, it is tracking per person GDP in high, middle, and low income countries between 1960 and 2002. So here's 1960. You've got your low income countries down here, your middle, and then your high income in the green. So you can see low income countries between 1960 and 2002 pretty much stayed stagnant. They rose a little bit, but not very much. Then you see your middle income countries here. They started right here. They went up and up a bit in the 80s and the 90s, but kind of leveled out after the 90s and even started to go down in the early 2000s. But then we see our high-income countries in the green, starting here around $11,000 per person in the country, and that has steadily risen with a couple little drops around 1974, but it's pretty much stayed on a steady path upward. So you can see that people in high-income countries, their wealth and income has been growing constantly, really, since 1960, whereas your middle-income and low-income countries have really not seen a big difference since the 1960s. And then we can look at this graphic in the upper right. How is the world's wealth shared among its population? So you can see here, 68, almost 70% of the people around the world control 3% of the global money. Then 22.9% of people around the world control 13% of all the global money. Then we see 7.7% of people in the world control 42.3% of all the global money, and less than 1% of people in the world control 41% of the global money. So we covered relative versus absolute poverty a little bit last week, but we'll just refresh those terms for you again this week. So relative poverty is a state of living where people can afford the necessities of life. So they can afford their rent and their food and clean water and pay their bills, but they're unable to meet society's average standard of living. So for instance, if one can't afford the newest iPhone, or if you can't afford to put a washer and dryer in your house, if you can't afford, a high-tech security system for your house, but that's relative poverty. So the main point for relative is you're not starving, you're probably surviving fairly well, you can eat and sleep safely at night, but compared to maybe the advertisements you see on TV or the possessions that your peers have, it's kind of this relative poverty. So in relation to other people in society, you might feel, quote unquote poor, but you're not really living in abject poverty like many people around the world are. So these little cartoons over here, the Beverly Hills panhandler with his coffee mug and tie, and has a sign that says, "I'm only middle class." And then this one on the bottom, they're all kind of sitting and begging with signs, and one says, "I can't afford Beats headphones. I bent my iPhone 6 and now it's broken. I can't afford to take the whole family to the Bahamas this winter." So these are examples of kind of relative poverty. Of course, on the other kind of end of that spectrum is absolute poverty, which is a state of living where people lack the basic necessities. They don't have adequate food, they don't have clean water, they don't have access to sanitation or safe housing, or access to health care and education. Absolute poverty is defined by the World Bank as when someone lives on less than $1.90 every day. And 88 million people around the world live in absolute poverty. And 3 billion more people live on less than $2.50 a day. So in 1990, around 36% of the global population lived in extreme poverty, but this has gotten quite a bit better actually since 1990. By 2015, the percentage of people living on less than $1.90 a day had dropped to 10%. So from 36% in 1990 to 10% in 2015. So things are definitely getting better on a global scale of wealth inequality. But an important point to keep in mind is that while things have been getting better in a lot of countries like India and China, the total number of poor living in sub-Saharan Africa has actually been increasing. And a third kind of term about poverty for you is subjective poverty. And this you can see that it's derived from kind of symbolic interactionism. So subjective poverty means that feeling rich or feeling poor all has to do with your surroundings and the people that you see or interact with. So feeling poor or feeling rich is kind of it's subjective. It depends on your own personal interpretation. So it has more to do with how a person or a family or a group defines themselves in relation to their society. Poverty is subjectively experienced when your actual income does not meet your personal expectations and perceptions. So how we feel about our economic standing is determined by our reference groups. To go back to chapter 5. So for example, a family in Nepal living on a few dollars a day might think of themselves as doing well, though someone from the United States traveling to Nepal might be overwhelmed by their quote-unquote poverty. So poverty, when we're thinking about subjective poverty, it really comes down to the people themselves and kind of how they're interpreting their own situation. People that we in the US look at and say, oh, what a sad life. They don't have a refrigerator or a cell phone. They must be very poor. Certainly there's people around the world who don't have a refrigerator or a cell phone, but still manage to be happy. Now on the next 4 slides, we're going to take a look at a term I mentioned a little earlier in the lecture, which is the global feminization of poverty. So the feminization of poverty refers to the fact that women feel the effects of poverty more than men do. As they usually have less job opportunities at hand, they might not have had as much access to education or loans than men in their society. And women, of course, also carry the responsibility for bearing and raising children. Globally, women only own 1% of the world's property, yet they account for 2/3 of the global hours worked. So during the 1990s, while overall poverty rates were rising in poor nations, the rates of impoverishment increased for women nearly 20% more than for men. At the same time, there was an expansion in the number of female-headed households. That was due to men, either leaving their wives or needing to move to another city or country in search of better work and opportunities. Women in poverty, they're also responsible for taking care of their families as well as working long hours in order to provide. And usually they work for a lower rate of pay than men would make. So it's far more difficult for women to get credit to start or expand businesses or to find free time to learn a new skill or spend time improving a craft. The persistence and consequences of household inequalities and biases against women can keep women from accumulating wealth or assets and underwrites restrictions on the civil rights of women. About 1.5 billion people live in absolute poverty, again, which means they're earning less than $1.90 a day in wages. 70% of that population living in absolute poverty is made up of women. Women perform 2/3 of the world's work, produce half of the food that is eaten, but only earn 10% of the world's total income. There are nearly 1 billion adults in the world today that are illiterate, and 2/3 of those people are girls or women. 60% of children who don't attend school are girls, and 1/3 of women are abused and coerced into sex during their lifetime. So these are just some more aspects of kind of what the global feminization of poverty means. The video on this slide is titled Addressing the Feminization of Poverty, and it comes from a news broadcast in Armenia, where they have this panel of kind of two experts in feminization of poverty, just discuss what they've seen and kind of their ideas for how to improve the situation for women, especially in poorer countries. So this video again highlights some important facts when it comes to feminization of poverty, like the fact that about 60% of people living in poverty around the world are women. And again, that rise in single female-led households due to men leaving for jobs elsewhere, or divorce and abuse, leading women to leave and kind of have to run their own households. And then the guy on the left in the video is kind of an activist, and he's been going into small towns on the edges of society in Armenia, and finding, of course, a lot of women living in situations that are very close, if not absolute poverty. And so this video in particular looks at the poor women in Armenia, and these interviewees advocate for empowering these poor women by encouraging them to organize and utilize their talents of sewing and knitting, beadwork, in order to produce textile products that can be sold outside the country with their help, of course. So this guy on the left is pretty well known for kind of helping women to produce products that are produced from skills that they already have and are very talented at, like sewing and beadwork. And then he kind of helps them find a market in richer countries to sell their products to. But he has helped kind of pull a lot of them out of that utter state of poverty, and given the women job opportunities and opportunities to be creative and express themselves and be independent, in order to help them kind of climb out of their situation. So the feminization of poverty, it's not just a problem for poor nations. It also presents itself in wealthier countries like our own. So the feminization of poverty shows its face even in rich countries. The United States has the highest poverty rates for women than any other industrialized nation. For every $1 a man is able to earn, a woman earns about 76 cents on the dollar for the exact same job responsibilities. 18 million women live in poverty in the U.S. alone. In the US, women are 20% more likely to be suffering from poverty than their male counterparts. Although only 20% of families have a woman as their head of household in industrialized countries, more than 50% of those female-headed households are living below the poverty line. And then elderly women make up the greatest share of the poor who are women, with nearly 7 out of every 10 elderly women living in poverty. Minority women are at even greater risk of suffering from poverty than, say, their white counterparts. And many women who are in poverty fall into a class known as, quote, the working poor, as they work 2, 3, 4 jobs to support themselves. So when we're talking about poverty and global inequality, who are the impoverished? The majority of the poorest countries, as we saw in those maps earlier in the world, are in Africa, with exceptions like Egypt. These countries often have a long history of civil wars and inadequate governance. They lack access to good arable land due to constant struggles over land ownership, lack of adequate rainfall, or lack in infrastructure for irrigation. Colonial forces, of course, stole and depleted many of Africa's natural resources quite a long time ago, leaving very little mineral and agricultural resources behind. And there's few opportunities, of course, for education and jobs. African income levels have been falling relative to the rest of the world. Africa is getting poorer. The 2014 Ebola crisis worsened this trend with the public health scare and the resultant economic downturn. And I'm sure we will see in the next year or two what the ramifications of COVID-19 have in terms of global inequality and the economic situation in Africa especially. There's 2 graphics on this slide. We'll focus on this one on the left first. So it says 75% of the world's poorest countries are in Africa. The 10 countries with the highest percentage of people living in extreme poverty are also in Africa, and extreme poverty being less than $1.25 a day. And 1/3 of people living in sub-Saharan Africa are undernourished. And again, when we discuss Africa, it's hard to do so without kind of contextualizing it within kind of the history of colonialism. So you can see on the right side here, in the mid-19th century, Africa remains largely unexplored due to harsh conditions, rough terrain, disease, and river rapids. Kind of like the heart of darkness, if you ever read that in high school. Then in the 1870s, Henry Stanley travels to Africa east to west and dubs it, quote, the Dark Continent. The next decade, in the 1880s, the Berlin Conference begins the parceling of African lands to European powers. Then from the 1880s until the middle of the 20th century, European imperialism continues to exploit Africa's natural resources. And in the 20th century, colonization is brought to a halt. Many African countries gain independence, but Africa is left in a kind of state of poverty, war, corruption, and unstable political, economic, and social systems. And then if we look at this graph over to the right, it's looking at regional poverty. around the world. And this graph has projections of global poverty in 2030. And it shows that absolute poverty rates in South and East Asia, right here, will actually be dropping by 2/3, but absolute poverty in sub-Saharan Africa will actually not be alleviated by 2030. So again, things are getting better poverty-wise around the world, mostly, with the exception of Africa, which continues to get more poor every year. So what are some consequences of poverty? Poverty often becomes a self-fulfilling cycle of poverty and disadvantage. The consequences of poverty are also its causes, meaning it becomes very hard to improve a nation's economic standing because of lack of food, shelter, clean water, access to education and technology. And this can hinder people from the tools that they need to become more productive, innovative, and wealthy. Sociologists Neckerman and Torch divided consequences of poverty into 3 different areas. Number 1 is the sedimentation of global inequality. And this means that once poverty is entrenched in an area, it is almost impossible to overcome it. The second consequence are the effects on physical and mental health. Of course, there's malnutrition, high infant mortality rates, younger death rates, emotional stresses of relative deprivation. And then the third consequence is the prevalence of crime and corruption. So countries that are stricken with higher poverty rates also have very high crime rates, and particularly violent crime. The last aspect of global stratification we'll be looking at today is that of slavery and poverty. So modern day slavery, which it does still exist, and poverty go hand in hand. 600,000 to 800,000 people are trafficked across the globe every year. There are between 10 and 30 million slaves around the world today. 47 countries globally have not yet recognized human trafficking as a crime in line with international standards. Nearly 100 countries still fail to criminalize forced labor, or if they do, the penalty for this form of exploitation amounts to nothing more than a fine. Less than 1/3 of countries protect women and girls from forced marriage. So here on this slide, you'll see there's 4 different broad forms of modern slavery. So first we have chattel slavery, and this is essentially what we saw in America when Africans were enslaved early on in our country's history. So chattel slavery is when one person owns another person as property. Other examples would be like child slavery and child prostitution. I'm sure if you've been watching the news, you're probably pretty up to date on the fact that child slavery and child prostitution is still a huge issue in our society, and even in rich Western countries. And if you've been watching the news about Jeffrey Epstein, you are aware of kind of the fact that this still is going on today. Then the second form of slavery is debt bondage. And that's when poor people pledge themselves as servants in exchange for the cost of basic necessities like transportation, room, and board. The third form of slavery is human trafficking, which is when people are moved away from their communities and forced to work against their will. And the fourth kind is servile marriage, which is when a person is promised or offered for marriage without his or her consent. So these graphic depictions on this slide kind of convey the problem of global chains of slavery in our modern day society. So over here on the left side, you can see up top, it's saying that $354 billion worth of goods in wealthy countries comes to us via slave labor. Many of the products we love to buy and use are produced by slave labor across the globe. Some of these are computers, cell phones, laptops, clothing, fish, cocoa or chocolate, and sugarcane. In 2016, over 15 million people were sold into servile marriages, and about 25 million people were sold into forced labor. The majority of the worldwide slave population today, as you can see on the map on the right, comes from Africa, Russia, and Eastern European and East Asian countries. So all these countries here that are shaded more in the orange and the red colors. And then on top here, you can see of those 40.3 million people that this study estimates are in slavery today, 71% of them are female and 29% are male. Now you'll notice there's different estimates for how many slaves there are in the modern world right now, and that's because, of course, it's very hard to get data on exact numbers, especially when you are kind of talking about criminal enterprises. But most of the estimates fall around 30 to 40 million. On this slide, I have a link to a pretty short video. It's called Slavery, a 21st Century Epidemic. And it's based on the 2013 Global Slavery Index, which was the first, it was kind of the first attempt to count how many slaves there were in the world today. And in that first study, they found that there were 30 million slaves around the world, and they surveyed 162 different nations. They found that countries with the highest prevalence of slavery are Mauritania, Haiti, Pakistan, India, and Nepal. And countries with the highest numbers of slaves are India, China, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. However, India is home to the vast majority of modern-day slaves. India has at least 14 million slaves, and it's usually Indians enslaving other Indians through debt bondage or chattel slavery. So 72% of the world's modern slaves are in Asia. The video also covers kind of complications with compiling information and data on slavery. Kind of what I was saying on that last slide, that it's very difficult to get an exact number. But trends show that slavery is becoming more prevalent over time and not less. So the slavery business is worth $32 billion a year, and $32 billion a year for the slavery business. And the amount of money the United States spends on fighting human trafficking each year is about what the U.S. spends to fight the war on drugs every day. And there's one last video on this PowerPoint. This one is a TED Talk entitled Modern Slavery Hidden in Plain Sight. And it comes from Kate Garbers, who founded the Slavery Footprint Project. So she says, once we begin to see slavery, it is staggering to realize how our lives are connected with it. The fish you eat, the iPhone in your hand, the laptop on your desk, the shirt you're wearing, all may very well be products of slave labor. So if y'all have time, I'd like you to go to this website that she helped to create, and it's up here in the title on the PowerPoint slide. It is slaveryfootprint.org/slavery, and it'll bring you to a website where you can take kind of this survey. It asks you about the clothes you wear, the food you eat, your toothpaste, your perfume, how many cars you have, etc. And once you take the survey, it will tell you basically how many slaves you have working for you based on kind of these global chains of commerce. So this concludes this week's lecture on Chapter 10, Global Inequality and Global Stratification. And I just wanted to end on a little positive note with a quote from Nelson Mandela. He said, "Poverty is not an accident. Like slavery and apartheid, it is man-made and can be removed by the actions of human beings." So I'll just leave you all with that. And I hope you all have a great week, and I'll see you back for Chapter 11 on race and ethnicity next week.